This is a continuation of the Gospel according to Peter. Early on the Lord's Day, Mary of Magdala, a disciple of the Lord, was fearful on account of the Judeans, and since they were inflamed with rage, she did not perform at the tomb of the Lord what women are accustomed to do for their loved ones who die. Nevertheless, she took her friends with her and went to the tomb where he had been laid. And they were afraid that the Judeans might see them, and were saying, "Although on the day he was crucified we could not weep and beat our breasts, we should now perform these rites at his tomb. But who will roll away the stone for us, the one placed at the entrance to the tomb, so that we may enter and sit beside him and do what ought to be done?" Remember, it was a huge stone. "We fear that someone might see us. And if we are unable to roll the stone away, we should at least place at the entrance the memorial we brought him, and we should weep and beat our breasts until we go home." And they went, and they found that the tomb was open. They went in, stooped down, and saw a young man sitting there in the middle of the tomb. He was handsome and wore a splendid robe. He said to them, "Why have you come? Who are you looking for? Surely not the one who was crucified. He is risen and gone. If you don't believe it, stoop down and take a look at the place where he lay, for he is not here. You see, he is risen and has gone back to the place he was sent from." Then the women fled in fear. The Gospel of the Lord. The Curraghkippane is a small little graveyard on the outskirts of Cork City, and many of my paternal forebears are buried there. And it has some other famous denizens besides my crowd. And it's an old graveyard going back probably 900,000 years perhaps. And the walls of the cemetery are really thick. They're about 4 feet thick, the actual walls. And built into the walls is the gatekeeper's house, which isn't much wider than the walls themselves. It's maybe 6 feet. So it protrudes 1 foot into the roadside and 1 side into the graveyard side. And it's called the Curraghkippane. And reputation is that the shortest funeral in the world took place in the Curraghkippane, and the longest funeral in the world took place in the Curraghkippane. The shortest one was the gatekeeper herself. She was called Mary. She was called Mary the Curragh. That's how she was known. And she lived in this little house in the wall of the cemetery all her life, and she was in charge of the place itself. And when she died and was being buried, they brought the coffin in through the front door. It's a tiny little door, and they had to turn the coffin over sideways to squeeze it through. But once they got her into it, they couldn't get her out through the front door, because if they turned it sideways, she'd have fallen out. And so they took her out through the back window, which was wider than the door. And so the shortest funeral in the world was literally 4 feet. It was the width of the wall. They got her out through the back window into the graveyard, and she was buried right outside her own back window. So it was 4 feet, the shortest funeral in the world. But it also had the longest funeral in the world. Because in Ireland the custom is that all headstones face east. And so the entire graveyard, all the headstones facing east. But there's one gravestone, a huge big Celtic cross, which is facing north-south. And buried in that place is a man called Jerome J. Collins. And Jerome J. Collins was a famous explorer who went both to the Antarctic and to the Arctic with Shackleton and Scott in the 2 places. And he survived his journey to the South Pole with Shackleton. He survived it. But subsequently, he went on a journey to the North Pole, and there was an accident among the group, and several of the people died, including Jerome J. Collins, and he died on the North Pole. And they took him down through Siberia, and all the way across Russia to Vladivostok, across to Alaska, down through the United States, across to New York, where he had lived for a period of his life, and then across the Atlantic to Ireland. So it was a 12,000-mile safari. So the longest funeral in the world is also in the Curraghkippane. But as you read the stories of these Arctic and Antarctic explorers, there's a disproportionate number of Irish people, there really is, in these expeditions. A hugely disproportionate number of Irish sailors who were part of those expeditions. And I can only think of one possible explanation for it. The weather is so bad in Ireland that we'll go anywhere to get away from it. North Pole, South Pole, Equator, whatever it takes, we'll go away from it. But when as a little child, I had this idea that when these guys went, say, to the South Pole, that they'd get into a ship and they'd sail away to the Antarctic, and then they'd dock their ship and they'd go on shore and they'd create a home base, their base camp, and then they'd rest for 3 or 4 days, and then they'd put on their backpacks and they'd walk to the South Pole. It wasn't a bit like that. If you read any of the expeditions, these expeditions took 2.5 years, each one of them. So they would land in a designated spot, and they would come ashore. There'd be maybe 30 or 40 of them, and some of them would never leave the base camp. There'd be a guy who was a designated cook, there was a designated carpenter, there was a designated photographer, there was a designated doctor, and often these guys wouldn't leave the home base at all. And often everybody would stay at home base for months and months at a time, depending on weather conditions. And then they'd set out, a party of about 10, and they'd go maybe 15 or 20 miles if they could really manage it over the course of about a week, and they'd create another camp and they'd put food supplies there. And then they'd go back to base camp. And then after another few weeks, they'd take more food and more resources, and they'd go to the first camp and then go beyond it another day's trip, and they'd create a second camp. And they would do that for months and months and months, getting nearer and nearer the pole. And then at one stage, they'd make a final assault. So they'd leave the home base, and now they had supplies all along the road, because it may take them 3 weeks to make the journey. And then of the 30 or 40 people who landed, maybe only 10 would be chosen for this final leg of the journey. And then when they got to the final camp where they had dumped the final piece, only 4 or 5 of them would be chosen for the actual final assault on the pole itself. And then if they got there, these 4 or 5, the trick then was to see, could you get them back home all safe and sound? So it was very, very different from how I imagined it as a child. It was a 2 or 2.5 year safari to get there. And finally, for the final assault, maybe 4 or 5 of the guys would make the attempt. Now, I'm going to use that as a metaphor today on Easter Sunday as I talk about resurrection. And I'm going to compromise today because I originally intended speaking to 5 points. And then at the beginning of Mass, Paul and Benjamin back there said, no, that's too much. Give us 3. So I've compromised and I'm going to give you 4. And the first one I will call Poor Old Job. And the second one, I will talk about the Gospel of Peter that we heard, 2 accounts of it. And then thirdly, I will talk about practicing the journey to earth. And fourthly, practicing the journey back home. So they're the 4 points I'll make this morning. So the first one, poor old Job. During the week, Joy rang me and said, do you really want this first reading on Easter Sunday? It's a real downer. And I had a quick look and I said, you know what? There may be some interesting stuff here. Leave it in and let's see what happens. And so as I was reading it this morning, what I got was that this was one of the first attempts ever to try to understand, the human condition and what happens to us. So it represents maybe some kind of a base camp from which we moved. So let me give you some of the history to it. With the development of language about 50,000 years ago, Homo sapiens didn't speak. Homo sapiens evolved in the plains of East Africa about 200,000 years ago. And although he was anatomically modern, he had no language ability. That only came with Homo sapiens sapiens 50,000 years ago. So Homo sapiens is the being who can think, but Homo sapiens sapiens is a being who can think about thinking. In other words, can be self-reflective. And the breakthrough from being able to think to being able to think about thinking was the development of language, which only came about 50,000 years ago, also in East Africa, probably modern-day Kenya. And it was only with the advent of language that Homo sapiens sapiens, for the first time ever, had the ability to wrestle with the idea of the transcendent. Only then do you find cave paintings in Spain and France and Lascaux. Because only when people can think about thinking, only when we have developed language skills which create mindsets, only then can we begin to wrestle with the notion of a hereafter or a transcendent or a divine. And so 50,000 years ago, we began this trek, this journey towards Christ consciousness. And the first steps were trying to understand who the gods might be. And that lasted for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. right down to about 5,000 years ago. And maybe the Egyptians were among the first to begin to think that mere human beings might survive death. And they prepared very elaborately for this. They prepared rituals for their pharaohs where they induced near-death experiences so that the pharaohs would actually have practice at what death was like, so that when it really came, they would survive on the other side. And so they would induce near-death experiences in these people, and in a whole bunch of companions, because the pharaohs would go with companions and resources into the afterlife. But the thinking was that it was only the ilk, the pharaoh ilk, that survived death. The rest of us poor guys, that was it, death was the end. But the great ones among us, they survived, and they had to be trained for how to survive in the afterlife, and so they would induce these near-death experiences. And there's actually rituals how they actually did this. So that's maybe 5,000 years ago. Then you come down to the time of Job, which was about 2,500 years ago. The book of Job was written about 500 years before Jesus. And the background to it is this. The last two tribes of Israel, Judah and Benjamin, were taken into exile by the great Babylonian Empire in the year 598 BC. And while they were there, they came under the influence of Zoroastrianism, an extraordinarily powerful, beautiful Middle Eastern religion, which had been seriously dealing with the notion of angels and spirits and life after death. And it had a huge influence on Judaism, and through Judaism on Christianity. And it was only then for the first time that within Judaism, they began to wrestle with the notion of life after death. Before that, in the Hebrew scriptures, there is no belief in life after death whatsoever. When you die, that's it. Now you can begin to see Job is wrestling with this idea. And he's using a whole bunch of metaphors. So when somebody dies, is that the end of it? Or are we like trees that you can cut them down and they'll grow again? He's wrestling with this notion. And so this is about 500 years before Jesus. When they come back, the Persians will finally overthrow the Babylonians, and they will free the Jews to go back into Israel. And they will bring this thinking back with them. But it will take a long, long time to make its way into the lore. And so Alexander the Great gives it a push. Alexander the Great, who flourished around 333 BC and who conquered the known world at that stage, created such a cultural vacuum that lots of mystery religions rushed in to fill the space. And now there's really serious consideration about life after death. And so at the time of Jesus, within Judaism, there's a split between the Pharisee party and the Sadducees. The Pharisees are the lay theologians, and they're hugely influenced by the Pharisees. In fact, their name may be related to that. Farsi and Pharisee may be related. Farsi is the language of Persia, and the Pharisees were the great teachers in Persia. So they're probably hugely influenced, and the Pharisees taught about life after death and spirits and angels. So at the time of Jesus, the Pharisee party believed in life after death, whereas the Sadducees, who were the priestly party, they did not believe in spirits or life after death. And there's this huge controversy in the time of Jesus. So when you listen to Job today, it's the beginning of the wrestling with the notion of life after death and therefore resurrection. That's one of the reasons I wanted to keep it in today, so we get a flavour for the evolution of this. This is my first point. My second point then, I want to talk about the Gospel of Peter. And at some stage, with God's help, I'll spread myself much more on this topic. This is a brand new gospel to most of us. But just to give you a very, very quick background, this was a gospel which was discovered in 1886 in Egypt, just about 60 miles north of Nag Hammadi, where a whole bunch of stuff would be found much later in 1945. It was discovered by a French guy, 1886. And it contained a document which dated back to the 8th century. The actual physical document dated to the 8th century, but the content of it dates back to probably 70 AD, around the same time that Mark's Gospel is being written. And it is basically an account of the death and of the resurrection of Jesus. And for the last few days we've been using it in our liturgies. But today you got two excerpts from it. You got verses 9 to 11 in the first reading and verses 12 and 13 in the second reading. And they're talking about what happened after Jesus had been buried. So I'm going to synopsize it a little bit for you. It's an extraordinary story. It's a very different account from that which you read of in the other four canonical Gospels. And so basically it says this. It says, on Friday evening when Jesus was buried, they sealed the tomb. They put 7 seals on the tomb. And they put soldiers guarding it, and also the priests and the scholars, they guarded it themselves. So they're there on Friday night making sure that nobody steals the body and then claims that he's risen from the dead. But somehow the word gets around, and so on Saturday morning, a whole crowd come out from Jerusalem to see and just stand around the tomb gawking. Is there going to be some action here? This guy said he was going to rise from the dead. Is he going to do it? And they wait for a few hours, and they go back home. And then on Saturday night, when it's totally dark, you get the first reading. And the two sentries are awake. The rest of the soldiers are sleeping, including the centurion and all of the priests, but they're all at the site. And all of a sudden there's a loud noise, and two beings come from the heavens. And they approach the tomb. And of its own volition, the stone rolls away. And these two men enter the tomb. And the soldiers are freaked out at this stage, so they wake the centurion. And there's a name given to the centurion. He's called Petronius. They wake him up, and they wake up all the priests, and they're watching. And as they're watching, 3 people come out of the tomb. And they're followed by a cross. And as they watch these people, the 2 guys on the side, they're helping the guy in the middle. They're holding his hands. And the guys on the side, we're told, their heads reach to the sky, giants. Whereas the guy in the middle, his head pierces the sky and goes up into the heavens. And the cross follows them. And as they're coming out of the tomb, a voice from heaven says, talking to the cross, "Did you preach to those who are asleep?" And the cross answers, "Yes." And they disappear. And they come everybody gets into a huddle. The priest, the centurion, everybody gets in the huddle and says, "What in God's name are we going to do?" And while they're still planning, another being comes down from heaven. This one looks like a son of man, like a human being. And he enters the tomb and stays there. And they're wondering, what the hell is going on here? And I'll tell you later what the hell is going on here with this guy. And now they're really freaked out. And they said, we better go back to Pilate. And we've got to figure out what to do here. Now, in this account, in Peter's Gospel, Pilate is not the one who condemned Jesus. It was Herod. Pilate washed his hands and said, "I have nothing to do with this man's death. You want to kill him? You kill him yourself. I'm totally blameless here." So in Peter's Gospel, Pilate has nothing got to do with the death. So when they come back to Pilate and they said, "Here's the story. Here's what's happened." Pilate said, "That's your problem. I told you I had nothing to do with this man's death. You ordered it yourself. You take responsibility." So they said, "Well, we need you to do this. We need you to order the soldiers and the centurions not to let this story be known. Otherwise, the people are going to catch us and kill us for killing this innocent man." So he agreed to that. He would tell the soldiers to keep silent. So they keep silent. Then the second reading picks up. It's now Sunday morning. And Mary of Magdala, who doesn't know any of this, who hadn't been able to wash the Lord's body and to put the spices on it for burial because it was the Sabbath before, now gets a few of her friends and they set out for the tomb. And they're really worried because they're afraid that people are going to catch them and beat up on them. And also they have a second consideration. There's a huge stone. Who's going to move this stone for us? But they actually get to the tomb and the stone is away from the entrance. And they stoop down. That's interesting to me. I never picked up on that before this morning. In all the accounts we were told that those who approached the tomb, they stooped down. So if we think the stone was like 8 feet in diameter, it probably wasn't. It was probably more 3.5 feet in diameter or 4 feet, because everybody had to stoop down to get into the tomb. So it's a big stone, but it's probably maybe 3.5 foot diameter. So they come to the stone, they look in, and they see this guy, the third one who came down from heaven, sitting in there. So what's he doing there? Here's what he's doing there. Imagine a whole bunch of us has been invited to go to a party at Tom's house. And we all go to Tom's house, and then we discover Tom's house really is too small. So we really need to go to Michael's house. And so we all go to Michael's house, but we're afraid there'll be some latecomers who'll come to Tom's house and they don't know where we are. So we leave somebody there to redirect everybody to Michael's house. And that's what this third guy was doing here. Jesus was gone. The party was now happening elsewhere. But for any of the latecomers who didn't realize where the party was really happening, they were going to leave an angel to sit there and say, no, not here, he's gone. He told you he was going to go. It's at Mike's house. The celebration is at Mike's house. So here's what the guy was doing this morning. But also in the text, you get this beautiful passage that Mary of Magdala went to do what women do for those whom they love. Now this is a fascinating passage to me. It wasn't Mary, the mother of Jesus, who did this. And it wasn't any of his aunts, and his aunts are mentioned in the scriptures. And it wasn't his sisters. His sisters are mentioned in the scriptures. So if this was a ritual of love, which was performed by a woman for the man whom she loved, why wasn't it his mother? Or why wasn't it his sisters? Or why wasn't it his aunts? Because Jesus and Mary had a very different kind of relationship, a very special relationship. Mary and Jesus, in my opinion, were total soulmates. She got who he was like nobody else got who he was. So it was Mary, and she didn't call on Jesus' mother to go with her, and she didn't call on Jesus' sisters to go with her, and she didn't call on Jesus' aunts to go with her. We are told she called some of her friends to go with her and do for her beloved what women do for those whom they love. So that's Peter's account of resurrection. Very, very different from the other accounts. That's my second point. My third point then is practice for coming down to earth. What is this whole earth safari about? And what are we doing here? Well, we're really just revisiting what God did as a game one time. Because God got bored. Originally, there's only God. The ineffable, unutterable, inarticulatable ground of our being. And this God exists in some kind of a Trinitarian format. There's the isness of God, whom we call Father. And there's God's total self-knowledge, whom we call the Son. And there's the love that God has for who she knows herself to be, that we call the Spirit. So there's isness, self-knowledge, and total self-love. But in order to experience herself, God had to create. And all of creation is this extraordinary game that God plays with herself, a game of hide and go seek. God wanted to see if she could create something which wasn't God. And so she attempted. Of course, everything is God. But some parts of God don't know that they're God. And this was the game. And she created various versions of this game. She wanted to find out if she created stuff which was not herself, would it recognize, in fact, that it was herself? And so the first version of the game was fairly simple. It's called soul. God created souls, which are bite-sized pieces of herself. In Judaism, in the Kabbalah, they call these sparks. But very, very quickly, the sparks recognized exactly. They knew they were God. They knew they were bite-sized pieces of God. So God developed a version 2 of the game. And in version 2 of the game, we now have causal bodies. Not pure souls, but causal bodies. And the trick was to see, could a causal body recognize that it was God? That was version 2. And version 3 was, from the causal body came an astral body, the emotional body. Could an astral body recognize that it was God? And then the toughest version of the game of all was the physical body. When the physical body was created, could somebody inhabiting a physical body remember who they really were? And that's the toughest game of all. And that's the game that all of us are playing, either successfully or unsuccessfully. We either recognize who we really are, that we are enfleshed spirit, that we are bite-sized pieces of God on planet Earth, that we are spirits in spacesuits, that we are souls on safari, or we don't, and we identify with our bodies. So there are the 4 levels. So God was practicing. That was the first practice. God playing a game of hide and go seek to see if every configuration could break the code and remember who it really was. Now, we do the very same thing. So the second attempt at it we call incarnation. Every single one of us has done this. And in my cosmology, every single one of us has done it many, 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 many times. We haven't just done it once. We've done it many, many times. We've taken exactly the same route that God took. We who were souls, who had neither a beginning nor an end, who were not born nor can die, we have descended through the same stages. So we left the soul state and we inhabited the causal state. What does the causal body mean? In the Hindu cosmology, the causal body is the repository of all of the experiences, of all the incarnations you've ever had in every dimension, and in every galaxy, every planet, every universe you've ever inhabited. All of that information, all of those Akashic records of your personal journey, they're all held at the causal body level. Every single one of you has descended to that. And every time you incarnate, you visit that level of body. Because it's like you're going back to a place you visited before and you want to check your notes to remember, what was it like the last 3 times I made the journey there? So you check your notes, you look at old photographs, old reports. Every time you come down, you visit your causal body to check up on all of the incarnations you've ever had in any dimension, but particularly if you're going to incarnate here, you're going to check all your previous journeys here to see what you need to remember for the journey down. So that's one stepping down. Then you're going to go from your causal body to your mental body. Now, this is why I wanted to use the explanation of the explorers. These are all base camps that we create on our journey to planet Earth. We don't just come from heaven to Earth in one single drop. Heaven is our base camp. We come down and we create camps every 15 or 20 miles, and we put resources for ourselves, and then we make the final assault, and the final assault is physicality. But there have been many stages to the journey before the physicality. And the causal is the first place. That's where we dump a whole bunch of resources. And the next one is the mental base camp. We dump a whole bunch of other resources here, like intuition, psychic abilities, deja vu experiences, instinctive responses to life. We dump all of these there so that on our journey down to Earth, we can call upon all of these things. Our third camp is going to be the astral camp, the astral body. And the astral body typically is the body we use when we're dreaming, when we travel at night and we dream. And it's the body we use when we emote. All of our emotions bring us into our astral body. And so what do we do at this level? At the astral level, we have all of the experiences of the last lifetime we lived. All of the experiences of the last lifetime. So where the causal body was all the notes we took from all the incarnations we had in all of the dimensions we visited, the astral body contains just the notes from the last incarnation on planet Earth. So it's like, now that I'm going to planet Earth, I want to just check up specifically, what did I do here the last time? What was it like for me here the last time? I want to check my notes. The next camp after that is called the etheric body. And the etheric body is literally the energy template that will allow me to make the final assault, the South Pole. And the South Pole is the physical body, my physical self. So the etheric body is the last depot where I drop supplies before I make the final assault on the South Pole. And here we are, every single one of us at the moment, at the South Pole. Every single one of us has reached the South Pole. We've made it. The trick is, will we make it home? Often, they didn't make it home. A lot of people perished en route. People got there. They made it to the South Pole or the North Pole, and then they died on the way back, like my friend Jerome J. Collins. So the question for us is, will we manage the return journey? Now, in the descent through all of these bodies, there's a communication line that's constantly open. All of these levels are in constant communication with each other. The soul is in constant communication with the causal. The causal is in constant communication with the mental. The mental is in constant communication with the astral. The astral is in constant communication with the etheric, and the etheric is in constant communication with the physical. The lines are open all the time. Except mostly, they're only open in one direction because we're asleep. There's information coming down all the time. The question is, are we aware of it, and can we establish a two-way communication? And that is the difference between a mystic and the rest of us. For the rest of us, the information is flowing in one direction, but we're totally unaware of most of the time. For the mystic, it's happening in both directions. Now, it's not just the mystics, because if you know anybody who's a healer is somebody who's in regular communication with the etheric body. The etheric body was the blueprint for our physicality. And any kind of physical illness manifests itself first at the etheric level. So a true healer is somebody who's in constant communication with the etheric body, their own or with yours. The astral level, dream workers, anybody who's working seriously with their dreams is somebody who's in constant communication with their astral body. Anybody who learned how to fly at night in your astral body, you're in constant communication with your astral body. Somebody who is an intuitive is in constant communication with their mental body. They're able to download significant bunches of data at will. People who are in contact with their causal body, what would they look like? They're psychics. People who have abilities like psychokinesis, teleportation, clairvoyance, clairaudience. They're people who've established that level of communication willfully and consciously. And people who are in constant communication with their soul level, we call these people mystics. And so there are people for whom this is a two-way communication. So that is the journey down. My final point is this then. How do we practice for the journey back home? And the interesting thing is, the first practice is death. Now, death gets a really bad rap. I'll tell you what death was meant to be like. Death was meant to be a conscious, volitional shape-shifting. It was meant to be a conscious, deliberate, dimensional dance, where we could waltz between dimensions, between levels of our own body, seamlessly and easily. That is what it is meant to be. Everybody's death is meant to be a shape-shifting from one level of body to the other. It's meant to be seamless and meant to be done lovingly, consciously, and volitionally. But it's gotten a real bad rap because we have misidentified. Most of us think we are this physical stuff. Most of us think we are our gross bodies. And so death then gets a really bad rap. We're scared of death in all its guises. And we experience death in many, many different ways. We experience the death of the ego when I feel like I'm going to be defeated in an argument. I'm going to lose face. I'm going to be embarrassed. These are ways in which we're constantly afraid of death. And we're afraid of the final demise. Now, the truth is, death should be a volitional, encouraged, shape-shifting between dimensions. And so when the physical body dies, it's hard to establish actually when it does die. We've changed our parameters. Does it mean when the heart stops beating? It used to mean that. Not anymore. You can revive somebody whose heart hasn't beaten for 2 or 3 minutes. Does it mean when you stop breathing? Obviously not. Little babies have been pulled out of ponds after 7 minutes of not breathing and being revived. Does it mean when your brain stops functioning? It doesn't even appear to be that. Because it's a known fact that, for instance, if a man with a very heavy beard dies at 9 o'clock in the morning, his beard keeps growing for several hours afterwards. By evening, he's going to have a shadow, although he's been pronounced dead for 6 or 7 hours. Because death is very hard to define, even physiologically. It's very hard to know when does it actually occur. Now, when you can establish that the physical body is gone, it takes the etheric body several days to die. And this is why the Hindus had the practice of cremation. They wanted to make sure that somebody who has died is not going to get attached to his etheric body and just stay around as a ghost. So by cremating, they also extinguished the etheric body. But the etheric body stays around for a few days. Now, the etheric body dies after a few days. Then we inhabit the astral body. And here's the good news and the bad news. We can inhabit the astral body for years at a time. 15, 20, 25 years. Or we can move on immediately. If we're Christ conscious, we can move on immediately. But you can get stuck at the astral body level. And I'll address this at the very, very end when I talk about stuff like poltergeist and ghosts, stuff like that. People were stuck at the astral level of body. We were meant to dissolve these levels of body one by one. We dissolve the mental level of body, which constructs our fears and our hopes. We dissolve the causal body, which still separates from others. And ultimately, we inhabit our soul again. We know who we are. And when the game wraps up completely, we abandon even our souls, because the souls are just bite-sized pieces of God, and we merge totally back into the Godhead. That's what it looks like. So that's what death really looks like, if I understand what it is and I embrace what it is. Now, how else do we make that journey? When you study evolutionary biology, you see in fact that over the last 4 billion years, the entire planet has been practicing this journey back to God. So all of phylogeny, all of the evolution of the entire species takes exactly the same route back. 4 billion years ago, there were only gross bodies. And gross, I don't mean bad, I mean just physical bodies on the planet. We call them bacteria. And for nearly 3 billion years, that's all that existed. All pre-mammalian animals, in a sense, just inhabit a gross physical body. With the advent of the mammals, which happened somewhere about 230 million years ago, with the mammalian brain and the development of the limbic system, we could now inhabit an emotional body or an astral body. So now we're going back to an astral body. We've left just the gross. And the connector between the two, the etheric body, we call that DNA. That's the blueprint for making the physical body. So we've gone from the gross body back to the etheric DNA to the astral body of our limbic systems where we can emote. Only about 2 million years ago, when we developed the neocortex, did we develop the ability to now inhabit the mental body. We learned how to think. And only in the last 50,000 years have we managed to reach the causal level of body, when we learn to speak and to talk to and negotiate with the transcendent. So you see, we've made a lot of the journey back, but there are still 2 more phases of the journey. Most of us still haven't made the journey from the causal body back into the soul. A few have. We call them avatars. These are the Jesus Christ of the world, or maybe the Mahatma Gandhis of the world, or certainly the Gautama Siddharthas of the world. These are the people who created the prototype for that next level of our evolution. And it will happen. That is the trajectory of the human experiment on planet Earth. It is not going to stop with Homo sapiens sapiens. Why would it stop with Homo sapiens sapiens? It has 2 more legs of the journey to go. And the next leg is Christ consciousness will break on this planet in such a way that every single one of us will get to be where Jesus was 2,000 years ago. I've said this to you before. I predict there will be a time on our planet when to know somebody's age is to know precisely what level they've reached. If you tell me such and such a person is 1 year of age, I will say, oh, she's learning how to walk. You tell me somebody is 2 years of age, I'll say, oh, he's learning how to talk. You tell me somebody is 7 years of age, I'll say, oh, he's learning to think rationally. You tell me somebody is 12 and a half, I'll tell you, wow, there's somebody who's now self-reflective. There will come a time when you tell me somebody is 30 years of age and I'll say to you, oh, great, they're mystics. They've reached the mystical stage. That's where we're headed. And the Jesus Christ of the world and the Mahatma Gandhis of the world are the prototypes that allow us to go there. And so all of phylogeny has been allowing us to practice this journey back. But not only phylogeny has been doing it, ontogeny has been doing it as well. The journey of every single one of us. When we start as tiny little infants, a tiny little zygote, once more we're identified with our physicality. The connection again between our physicality and our etheric body is the presence of DNA and our chromosomes. For the first 8 months, the child is totally body identified. Beginning about age 8 months, the child now begins to develop the ability to feel their own emotions. Now they've developed to the astral level. They'll be dreaming as well at this stage, copiously. At age 7, every single child will reach the mental body level. They will be thinking rationally. At age 13, every single one of us will be reaching self-reflection. We will have developed into the causal level of ourselves. So ontologically, every single one of us is recapitulating and practicing this journey home. And it's in that context that we can understand resurrection. That is what resurrection is about. Resurrection is the ability, while still in physical spacesuits, while still in our gross bodies, to make all of the journey back through all of those stages, so we learn to be non-dual mystics. And the non-dual mystic is the person who has 1 foot solidly in the physicality of ourselves and the other totally in the sky. And that is what the person in the middle of the other two was doing when we were told their heads reached the sky, but the guy in the middle, his head pierced the sky and went into the heavens. That is what resurrection is about. It is for every single one of us to reach to the heavens and beyond while we're still grounded on planet Earth, that we can simultaneously inhabit all levels of body. The trick is not to get stuck. So let me just tell you what getting stuck looks like. People who are professional ghostbusters, and I have a good friend, Jerry Sullivan, who was an official professional ghostbuster way back in the 60s and 70s and was a consultant to many of the movies. He claims there are 3 levels here, 3 levels of stuckness. The first level is called poltergeist. And poltergeist is about ghosts who seem to throw things about. But in actual fact, they're not ghosts at all. They're not other beings. Poltergeist are merely the etheric body of a living individual. Very, very typically teenagers who are right on the cusp between the journey from the mental body to the causal body. Very typically it's teenagers. And they're both manifesting and moving physical objects. So the energy is not coming from the outside. When you investigate this, this is psychic energy being generated by the etheric body of a living entity, mostly teenagers. What about hauntings? What are hauntings? Hauntings are evidence of the etheric body of a dead person. It's like energy has been trapped. Particularly the energy of a particularly traumatic incident is being trapped in a physical location, and it just keeps playing around and around and around and around and again. But it is not real in the sense that you can't interact with it. You can see it or hear it, but you can't have a dialogue with it. Now, I feel like the 9/11 incident was such a thing. When they showed these planes crashing again and again and again and again and again, it felt to me like it was the etheric body of an entire species fixated on a single event and replaying it again and again and again and again. It was the haunting of the 21st century. We need to let go of this kind of thinking, as much as we need to let go of the energy of any haunted place, which is just the stuck energy of a traumatic event stuck in a particular physical location. Enough already with that. And the final piece he talks about is apparition. Apparition is different. Apparition is the astral body of a person who is dead, as distinct from the etheric body. And you can dialogue with an astral body. You can be in communication with an astral body. It's a totally different thing. It's like a teleconference, a video teleconference, except that instead of having a flat screen, you have a hologram. You have a holographic image of a person in Tokyo that you're having a business meeting with. And you can interact with each other in real time. But it's a holographic image. And this is what resurrection means to me. It is that we can have real life encounters with a holographic image of the astral body of Jesus Christ. As Paul said last night, it is not about the physical molecules of Jesus Christ rising from the dead and visiting with people. It is that people had incidents, occurrences, interventions by the astral body of Jesus Christ, a holographic version that they could really interact with. And mostly to get into that space, they needed to be in an altered state of consciousness themselves. And nothing seems to have precipitated an altered state of consciousness as much as their Eucharistic celebrations. It was again and again and again in the context of Eucharist that we are told they recognized him in the breaking of bread. There was something about Eucharist that created the mindset in the worshippers that allowed them to have a real-time encounter with a holographic astral body of the risen Jesus. And that's what I would like to offer today. And that's what I'm trying constantly to do in our Eucharist. To try to create languaging and to try to create energy which allows every single one of us to enter into the same kind of altered state of consciousness so that every single one of us can have real-time encounters with the holographic, astral, resurrected body of Jesus, because that is the prototype of where we're meant to be headed. If you can have that kind of encounter, death has no longer a sting. Death is meaningless in the sense that I'm afraid of it. Death now becomes the volitional shape-shifting among the dimensions.